So settlements are primarily mud brick, made out of mud brick, and it was whitewashed. The communities show some narrow, winding streets, so some planning, but not as strict as we find, say, in Harappa that we're going to talk about next week. So you can kind of see the mud brick construction here in the Anu Ziggurat. This was some of the earliest monumental architecture in the area. Now what we see here, though, in the Uruk period is that there's a change in the deities. So where before we had a water god, now we're starting to see two primary deities emerge. An is male sky god, and then Inanna, who's female. So the big question is then, why change in deity? And we'll come back to that in just a minute. But we know that there's continuation in the culture because the floor plan is basically the same as the temple at Eridu. But because of the size of the structures, we're seeing a shift in social structure. Somebody's got a lot of control over the labor force. And in this particular plan map, you can see, let's see if I can, a city wall. So again, all these major settlements were walled, and a good indication of conflict. We start to see labor specialization, where we have metalworkers, we have pottery production, so a lot of heterogeneity. We see mass production of undecorated utilitarian vessels, these like beveled rimmed bowls. So they're all the same size, and some people refer to them as ration bowls. So it's possible that the people who were building these public works were being paid in grain. We see increased trade. So you can kind of see here different trade routes. And they do spread all over, all the way to Egypt, and they're even going south here. So quite a bit of trade going on in the region. We see things like shell, carnelian, lapis lazuli, onyx, alabaster, silver, gold, copper. All of these things are being traded. And we do see quite a bit of kind of fancy work with the beads and so forth. And here's some jewelry from actually a royal burial. Some of the other traits of the Uruk period are the wheel. So the wheel is invented here, and that becomes important to both trade and war. And you can actually see the wheel here in this bas relief carving. We see the plow, an important invention as it increases agricultural yield, so you can intensify production. Again, the potter's wheel becomes a little bit more widespread in the area, so you can produce things somewhat faster and more uniformly using the potter's wheel. Sailboats. So we do see trade, Turkey, Levant, northern Mesopotamia, but also all the way down the Persian Gulf. So boating. I'm not saying that this is actually the boat that they developed, but it's just a picture of an ancient sailboat that I found. So that becomes an important instrument in trade. We see class stratification emerge. It still looks like it's kin-based, but people are members not just of their families, but of an occupational group or a social group, or a trade guild might be a good word for it. But we do see like the god king, who takes over power from temple priests and becomes the supreme leader. Then we see our nobles, then we see businessmen, artisans and farmers, scribes, and then slaves. So again, rulers are taking over power of the temple culture. So if you think about that in conjunction with the shift in deities, it might make a little more sense, because the earlier deity associated with the temple priest and their power, if we come up with some new deities then that are supporting the new kings, again, a way to justify rule. It does seem from all the evidence that the rulers were pretty tyrannical. They controlled the wealth, they imposed taxes, they could impose religious sanctions, and use military subjugation. We see radical changes in burials during this Uruk period. So, quite opulent. One of the most famous burials from this time period is of a woman called Puabi. Sometimes she's called Lady Puabi, other times Queen Puabi. This is found in the site of Ur. There were 2,500 burials found there, and only 16 of them were large tombs with kind of opulent grave goods. But the Queen Puabi burial, we found skeletal remains on a wooden bier, and the body itself The upper part of the body was hidden under a mass of beads, so gold beads, silver, carnelian, agate, chalcedony, lots and lots of beads. There was a headdress here made of semi-precious stones and gold. We see all sorts of fabulous gold and stone inlaid artifacts. This is actually part of a lyre. We see sacrificial people included. There are about 59 men, women included in Queen Bwabi's grave. Most of them are women within the main burial chamber, but outside of the burial chamber, there are actually 6 male skeletons with wagons, and each of the men had copper knives and helmets. What's interesting is the position of the bodies actually suggests that all of these people could have been retainers, went in willingly and maybe took some poison then, because the bodies aren't necessarily carefully placed. It almost looks like they died and then fell right there. Non-royal burials have few goods, so again, class stratification quite evident in the burials of the Uruk period. The other thing that's important about this time frame is cuneiform writing, so the first formal writing system in the world. And cuneiform simply means wedge-shaped marks. This emerges around 5,500, 5,000 years ago, and it grew out of an earlier pictograph system. There are about 850 signs, and these represent distinct words and syllables, but what's interesting is we don't find a grammar. So it's possible that this was really meant to be something that could be read by lots of different people. It does seem like it was primarily economic purposes that it was used for instance, keep track of trade goods. Now, during this whole period, which is sometimes referred to as the dynastic period, and these are the Sumerian states, which I think I forgot to say, there are actually about 13 of them that were constantly fighting with one another. So these are city-states. Each state had its own ruler, but they shared a common suite of traits, which is why we refer to them all as Sumerian. But almost constant warfare between these city-states, so there's a lot of shifting in power. Other things that were happening during this time period is that the burial population indicates an increase in epidemic disease, so things like cholera and typhoid, and this could be because of the urbanization, lack of sanitary conditions, so wells and irrigation canals could get polluted and get passed on to the human population. Now, around 4,334 years ago, around about then, Sargon of Akkad starts a series of successful military campaigns, and he actually has 34 successful military campaigns, and he just moved south. Here's Akkad. He just moved south down the Olivian to begin with, just conquering city-states as he went. When he would conquer a place, he would post an Akkadian as an administrator there to help maintain his power. So this started the unification process. And you can see he had quite a large territory here. The unification process, though, is not completed until Hammurabi sweeps in 1,000 years or so later. So that's kind of it on Mesopotamia. It's a lot of information, but it actually is only kind of skimming the surface.